This diagram is called the Permaculture Flower. It was created by David Holmgren, who is one of the co-founders of the permaculture movement. I like the diagram because in such a simple image, Holmgren has summarized many of the aspects of human life, the aspects of the human ecology. Holmgren reminds us that each of these realms of human endeavor, each of these petals, need to be moved towards sustainability. Each of these petals need to be powered down. Each of these petals need to be pulled back from 5 planets worth of consumption and realigned with something more like one. Oftentimes, when we talk about environmentalism, we think about nature, mountains and rivers and oceans and forests. We think about the bees, the monarchs, polar bears, whales, and all the other critters that live there. But in Holmgren's diagram, land and nature stewardship is only one of the petals. We also need to think about our buildings. How can we take what we have and convert it into something more aligned with one planet's worth of consumption? Local and more sustainable materials, sure. But what about HVAC? Can an existing building be retrofitted, thereby reusing what already exists rather than tearing down to rebuild? And what about square footage per capita? In some versions of the flower diagram, Holmgren labels this petal built environment. This reminds us that we need to rethink our city footprint as well. Are we creating spaces to fit with human-powered transportation like walking and biking? Are we creating community gathering spaces and rebuilding the idea of commons? Are we creating spaces where people feel comfortable after the studies of Christopher Alexander? What are we doing about major utilities and infrastructure? And as we make these changes, are we alert to the issues of green gentrification? Are we elevating people who have been denied a voice in American society? The tools and technology petal includes everything from our transportation system to our power grid, our garden tools, water cisterns, and solar panels. All of these need to be peeled back from 5 planets worth of consumption and realigned with something more like one. Now, in the early days of permaculture, the movement focused fairly exclusively on land, particularly open land, and how to sculpt it for more sustainable uses. When Holmgren introduced this diagram, the lower petals were revolutionary. The idea that we needed to make our education system and our cultural messages more sustainable. Education and culture is about the messages we teach each other as adults, as well as what we teach the next generation. Are we teaching about the more society, or are we teaching more sustainable practices? In light of the problem of disenfranchisement, this culture petal can also address whose culture is taught. Are we teaching only white practices? Or are we embracing diverse cultures and practices to create a multifaceted community? The culture petal can include things as simple and intimate as the messages we send to our friends and family. Do we forward an Instagram meme advocating shopping therapy? Now that we know about 5 planets worth of consumption, is this kind of stuff funny anymore? Are we helping with cultural change? When a friend announces she's going to Paris for the weekend, how do we choose to respond? So for the health and spiritual well-being petal, our U.S. healthcare system is far from sustainable. It's easy to look at the mountain of single-use items that pass through our fingers during COVID. Use it once and throw it away has become widely acceptable practice. We'll cover that in another unit. But the problem goes much deeper than that. Our conventional medicines are highly refined in laboratories. They can be extremely expensive, and access is limited through gatekeepers, and some portions of the population are excluded from accessing them at all. Within the context of the Great Unraveling, Western medicine has serious problems with 5 planets worth of consumption, peak everything, economics, and disenfranchisement. Yet humanity has a rich and vital collective wisdom around healing. There are many modalities exist in the world. Healing modalities developed in other cultures often take a more holistic approach, healing the whole body, the ecosystem, one could say. As for spiritual well-being, Peter Rood showed me some sustainability issues within mainstream American religious practices. Sure, there are movements like Interfaith Power and Light, which emphasizes climate action, and green sanctuaries, which encourage reuse, and other practices which we might call light green. But few religious institutions address 5 planets worth of consumption. Few religious institutions confront wealth disparity, misogyny, and subtle racism. So our religious communities have far to go in advancing towards greater sustainability. And in being inclusive, we must remember that to many people, spiritual well-being is much broader than just formal religion. Moving to finance and economics, Holmgren reminds us that our financial world needs to take giant steps to join in the movement towards sustainability. We'll cover this in a future unit, but its presence as its own petal on the Permaculture Flower reminds us that finance and economics is an important piece of the puzzle we need to solve. So when I get to land tenure and community governance, this is where I remind everyone that Holmgren is from Australia and they use different terminology than we do in the US. This petal is about both governmental systems and our legalities for holding land. Holmgren, together with several others such as Tom Friedman, point out that in the journey towards sustainability, government too must reform. How can we progress towards sustainability given the structures we currently have? Voter disenfranchisement, citizens united, 1%ers holding office? Possibly not. Authors and activists such as Leah Penniman and Charles Eisenstein point out the problems with our system for holding title to land, controlling what happens with land. Land ownership in the U.S. is fraught with racism. Inheritance laws consolidate power to the extreme wealthy, and we have eroded the concept of commons, or land that is held by everyone for the public good. Many of our ideas about land need restructuring as we move through the Great Turning. At the center of the Permaculture Flower, Holmgren puts the graphic symbols for his permaculture ethics and permaculture principles. I'll cover those in a different video. But he shows the permaculture ethics and permaculture principles as spiraling outward through all the petals, influencing these different sectors in greater and greater layers over time. To me, the spiral also reminds me that these petals overlap, that they are interconnected, that one influences another. Holmgren has been using this flower diagram in his work for decades. Versions of the diagram from the early 2000s included notes around the edges of the petals, suggestions of what types of activities in those sectors might be more sustainable. Yet the petals themselves have changed very little through all these years. The permaculture flower stands as a reminder that we need to move through each of these sectors of human activity toward more sustainable operations. The permaculture flower with its 7 petals becomes a reminder to us that our work is multifaceted and interrelated. To me, the permaculture flower is also an invitation for each of us to pick the place where we want to work. Just about anything you select needs to move toward greater sustainability. So, where are your passions? What area appeals to you? How do you like to work with children? Do you like to care for the sick? Do you like to build things? All of these hold opportunities to bring the world closer to sustainable practices. So pick your petal of the permaculture flower and start there.